Welcome then to the Movement for the Abolition of Wars 2015 Remembrance Lecture. Many thanks again to the Imperial War Museum for hosting us so wonderfully. I'm Tim Devereux, I'm Chair of MORE, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Rogers. Today, Remembrance Sunday, in this building, with its stark stories of wars past and present, his topic is future wars and how to prevent them. Professor Paul Rogers.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, for those very kind words, and I hope I can do justice to what you say. It's a real privilege to be here. I am from London originally. I'm from East London, and I remember visiting the museum as a boy. It's many years since I was last here, and I've had an hour or so to go around, and it's very interesting in so many different ways. But it gives you, I suppose, one side. It does give you some of the other side of the story, but mostly it gives you one side of the story. And it is obviously concerned primarily with wars in the past, and I want to look a little bit more to the future. But I hope you'll indulge me a little bit if I talk about sort of semi-personal experiences of past wars. I moved up to Yorkshire as a social and economic migrant when I got married 45 years ago. My wife's father had married quite late, and he was already 80 years old when we got married. And he lived with us for the last 10 years of his life, and not entirely in failing health. He'd had a remarkable life. He'd born in 1890, and in the very early part of this century, he was apprenticed first as a carriage maker, and then he worked as a horseman. Now, horseman was one up the scale from a groom, and he worked at some of the big houses in West Yorkshire in the Huddersfield area. Naturally enough, when he joined the army at the start of the First World War, he was taken into the Royal Artillery because he knew about horses. And at the time, at the start of the war, almost all the long-range artillery guns were horse-drawn. He survived 3.5 years on the Western Front. He only came back twice, both severely injured on a stretcher. He would never talk about it. In fact, right at the end, when he was approaching 90, I would occasionally have small conversations with him. But it was clear that the horrors were still with him. And the fact that he showed such a resilience in spite of extraordinary scars was something which I always remember. If we go through to the Second World War, as I say, I'm a Londoner. I'm from East London. I went to school in Walthamstow. My own father, at the start of the war, actually volunteered, and he volunteered to join the RAF. He actually wanted to be in Bomber Command. I suppose, fortunately for me and the rest of the family, his eyesight was too poor, and he was eventually put into the London Fire Brigade, which, as it happened, was probably the second most dangerous occupation because so many firefighters got killed during the war. But he survived, and towards the end of the war, he was actually involved with officer education. One of his other posts, though, was to join the crew who were doing the 24-hour organisation of civil control, civil defence right across London, and they were down in a bunker underneath or just next to the Geological Museum. He happened to be on duty the night of the 12th, 13th of June, 1944. And at about 4:30 in the morning, the first of the V1 flying bombs hit a bridge in Grove Road, just in fact in South Chingford, killed 6 people and did a great deal of damage. He was not very senior in the fire service, and the people at his level had no knowledge of this new weapon, this vengeance weapon. And it was just put down as pilotless aircraft. And of course that became, for something like a year afterwards, one of the biggest threats to London, along with the ballistic V2s. The V1 was essentially a very crude but very potent unguided cruise missile. And in a sense, the direct descendants have been used by the Americans and the British, and of course recently the Russians in the Middle East. There is, if you like, a continuum. So in a way, in both examples from the First and Second World War, they're very powerful lessons which relate to many of the exhibits in this museum. My father-in-law's experience in the First World War and his deep reluctance to talk about it. My father's experience in the Second World War, in a sense leading us right on in technological terms, even to the present day. Let me start with 2 points, and they're sort of at opposite ends. And bear with me on this first one. It may strike you slightly odd. When I first went up to live in Yorkshire, I remember on an early occasion I had to drive over to York. Nowadays, there's a route from Huddersfield through to York via the extension of the M1. It wasn't there then, and you used to go through Wakefield up the A642 up to Tadcaster and then join the main road to York. You could go by a small by road, which I took one day, not having taken it before and having time to spare. And that went over open, rolling countryside, mostly arable, quite chalky, quite flinty in parts. And at one point, going along the road, there was a little cross, stood about sort of 6 feet high, by the side of the road, just next to a holly bush, a sort of a 10 or 15 yard holly bush. I didn't know what it was. I stopped the car to have a look. There was no indication. And all it had on it, and this would have been April, I think, of that year, was a date, 1461, and underneath a little wreath, laid recently. So I couldn't understand this. It was near, on the way to the village of Saxton, just near the village of Towton. So I looked up the details when I got home. If you take that route now, there's a small lay-by with some very good descriptions of the battle that took place there. The Battle of Towton, fought on Palm Sunday, 1461, is the climactic, but not the final battle of the Wars of the Roses between the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. It was appalling. The Yorkists won, for what it's worth, mainly because when it started early on Palm Sunday, in a snowstorm, the wind was behind them and the arrows carried further. At the end of the day, 28,000 people were dead. And that was out of a population in England of barely 3 million in one day. It's broadly equivalent to the entire losses throughout the First World War for the United Kingdom as a whole in one single day. And that's Towton, 600 or so years ago. I say that because, in a sense, one always had to get a sense of perspective if you're looking forward to the future. Because when you're trying to tease out what the causes of wars might be, it can get extremely depressing. And what one also has to remember is that in times far past, carnage in many occasions with smaller populations has been even worse. And there are people who argue, like the Harvard social psychologist Steven Pinker, that in fact we're slowly getting more peaceful. And his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, is worth anybody's read. You may not agree with it entirely, but it presents a different dynamic, a different way of looking at violence. So I always remember Towton, and it stuck with me. In fact, quite often, if I'm going to that part of the world, I'll go past that and just remember it, because it does give you this sense of perspective. The other thing I wanted to mention was just one single quote, which is looking much more to the future. And this is a quote from a conference which was run over 40 years ago at one of the Northern Polytechnics. It was by a group of staff who were trying to bring together, this is the early 1970s, the issues of development, environment and security in a single conference. And they were very lucky to have a quite extraordinary speaker by the name of Edwin Brooks. Edwin, who developed a career later in Australia, is not known in Britain, had been a Member of Parliament, a Labour Member of Parliament. He'd been a chair of the Conservation Society, and he was a lecturer in economic geography at Liverpool University when he came to speak. And he talked about the risk of the kinds of problems we would have within 40 or 50 years if we didn't actually alter our attitude to the broad concept of security. And one particular phrase he used has stayed with me all through the years, and I've used it quite a lot myself, quoting from him. And he said, dystopia that we have to avoid is, quotes, a crowded, glowering planet of massive inequalities of wealth, buttressed by stark force, yet endlessly threatened by desperate people in the global ghettos. That was 1972. The book was published in 1973 or 74. And here we are, 40 plus years later, moving steadily into that world. And I remembered what he was saying when I was looking at the television cameras of the soldiers and the barbed wire going up to keep the refugees out of Europe just a few months ago. So what I want to do really, if I may, is to talk, certainly no more than half an hour, about what the future problems might be. And the timescale is the next 30 years. It's not the immediate future. There will be a resonance of what's happening in the Middle East, but I want to look much longer term. So it is necessarily speculative, and I admit that. And you may have lots of disagreements with the things that I've tried to pick out, which I think are the really significant trends. Nevertheless, I think it is worth giving a go. We then have plenty of time for questions, but I know many people who may have just come in for 3/4 of an hour or so. So what I suggest we do is when I've finished doing the talk, we'll just take a break for a minute. And then if anybody needs to leave, please feel free to do so. And then we'll just open it up for questions, maybe for half an hour or so. But again, I know many of you may be here for other purposes as well, so do feel free to leave during the course of the questions. But rather than ask for questions during the talk, I'll do the straight talk, and then we can actually move on to the discussion and maybe the disagreements as well. If we look to the future over the next 30 years, what I'd like to suggest is the three overall drivers worldwide, things which are happening, trends, which are likely to dictate the kinds of security issues we may have, are the chances of peace and the risks of war. The first of these is, very bluntly, worldwide, the widening socioeconomic gap, the widening wealth-poverty gap. It's not easy to recognize in a country like Britain for most people, even though about a quarter of our own population has got relatively poorer, particularly over the last 10 years. And it's not easy to place it even worldwide because there have been huge developments in many parts of the world. You probably have 100+ million people in China who will be rated in wealth terms the equivalent to, say, a European middle class. Maybe 50 to 80 million people in India, similarly, maybe 20 million in Brazil, maybe a million and a half in a country like Kenya or Uganda. There has been a huge development, a huge range of economic growth, but it has been incredibly divisive. It's not been accompanied by higher standards of socioeconomic justice, equity, emancipation. And essentially that is a trend which has developed particularly since the early end of the 1970s, during the period of the transition to what we call neoliberal economic policies, the Washington Consensus on development in the global south, and a whole panoply of things which developed in the late 1970s. It's interesting, in fact, to note that if you look at world economic growth as conceived conventionally, it was actually higher in the 40 years before 1970 compared with the 40 years after it. People don't tend not to appreciate that, and that's in spite of all the problems in the Second World War. But the problem is that the kind of system that we now have, what to put bluntly, isn't fit for purpose, because it is not delivering the fairness that it should deliver. And you're seeing this expressed in many different parts of the world in many different ways. But it's a fundamental issue, and all the trends indicate that it is not changing. You can use all the different measures. I think there was a quote from Oxfam recently that, you know, the 60 or 70 wealthiest families in the world are wealthier than a whole cluster of states. That the wealthiest 1% is equivalent in wealth to about 50% of the poorest worldwide. More particularly, the richest 20%, which probably frankly includes the great majority of us in this room, certainly have 85% of the wealth and the household income. That is a trend which is still developing. And it's leading to, in many ways, more and more resentment. Part of the reason for that, paradoxically, is one of the real great successes of international development over the last 40 years, and that is huge improvements in education. Very early in my career, before I moved over to work in the area I now work in, I worked for a couple of years in Uganda on a regional agricultural program, and I had some friends who were local teachers, and I learned a fair bit about what the Ugandans are trying to do. They were trying to get as many of their kids through 4 years of primary education as they could, so that at least people will be literate and the rest. And they were not too bad in terms of the gender gap as well. It could have been better, but it wasn't too bad. At that time, the entire country had one university, a college, Makerere, which had maybe 2,000 or 3,000 students, in a country even at that time of about 15 million people. You go back to that part of the world now, and you see that Uganda has succeeded in basically getting just about everybody through primary education, most through high school, and I think there's something like 7 or 8 universities scattered across the country. It's been a transformation, and that is repeated right across the global south. There are some areas where the gender gap is too still perniciously wide, but even that is slowly changing. But the point about this is, with huge improvements in literacy, communication, media, even the sort of the spread of the internet, people are much more aware of the nature of the world that they live in the broadest sense, both in the country and transnationally. In other words, people are much more aware of their own marginalisation. And we're talking about the majority margins. It's an odd concept. You assume margins mean a minority. We're talking about the majority in terms of a fair share of the development of the world as a whole. Some of you, the older ones among us, will remember a phrase which was very popular 30 or so years ago among the sociologists, and that was the so-called revolution of rising expectations in Britain. The idea that things were getting steadily better, and wherever you were on the social ladder, your life was improving. Now you have the much more common problem of the revolution of unfulfilled expectations, or even frustrated expectations. And you're seeing that in many different parts of the world. And in not a few places, it turns out into really very considerable violence. You look at the almost unreported neo-Maoist Naxalite rebellion, which has plagued large parts of India for the last 30, 40 years. And that is being repeated in many countries. So you have a situation in which you have the world economy not delivering what it should deliver. And we're already seeing, in a way, the kind of thing that Edwin Brooks was talking about. The second trend links in very much, and in fact in some ways it's represented in the banner at the front, and that is we are for the first time in human history finally facing up to the environmental limitations dictated by the entire planetary system, the biosphere or the global ecosystem, call it what you will. We've had major problems of pollution and dereliction and the rest at national and regional levels. It is only really in the last half century, and in many ways in the last 30 years, that we've begun to realize this is now a global phenomenon. We did get a very clear early warning of it back, about 32 or 33 years ago, when it was found that the ozone layer, which protects us from excess ultraviolet B radiation from the sun, was starting to be decayed by a cluster of chemicals, the chlorofluorocarbons, which were believed to be entirely without effect, used like the gas in the packaging of Big Macs and the rest, used in refrigeration, used in aerosols, used to propel fire extinguishers. And the CFCs, it turned out, were degrading the ozone layer up in the upper atmosphere, and the O3 molecules were going into O2, and the end result was that you were starting to get increases in ultraviolet radiation. Fortunately, in a way, it was asymmetric in that for various complex reasons, it affected the South Pole region greatest every spring. And that was picked up by a team led by Joe Harman of the British Antarctic Survey in 1983, and they realized that in fact the ozone layer almost disappeared for a couple of months. So in other words, if there'd been life round the South Pole, it would have been extremely difficult for it to survive. That message got through very quickly. It keyed in with other things that people were already learning. And extraordinarily, the Montreal Convention, which started the long process of phasing out these CFCs, took place only 4 years later. There are times when you have real issues obviously facing you, when even governments, intergovernment groups, will act quickly. There is a sting in the tail, though. It's going to take many years before the ozone layer completely repairs itself. There are still CFCs being liberated from old refrigerators on dumps across the world. It's still a problem, but it is diminishing. It was recognized. But the key thing about it was this was the first occasion when we as a species were having an entire global impact, one single impact, which brings us on obviously to the huge one. And that, course, is what you might crudely, some people are now calling crudely, carbon pollution. In other words, the rise of global temperatures, the changes in the climate disruption following the production, the burning of very large numbers, gigatons even, of fossil fuels. Now this again is a worldwide phenomenon. It is partially recognized, in fact more so almost by the day, with the Paris conference coming only in 3 weeks' time. But it is a far more difficult problem to deal with than the CFCs and the ozone depletion, because it affects the whole way that we live and work industrially. And there have to be absolutely radical changes on that. But just remember what we know now about what will happen if we do not get to grips with it. And that is going to be really hugely traumatic. There are two things about climate change which we now understand rather more fully than we did. The one is that it is quite deeply asymmetric. Many years ago, it was thought that it would mainly just affect the northern and southern tropics, because natural climate change over millions of years tended to have that kind of effect when it occurred through natural factors. And people used to think in the 1990s, well, it's going to be difficult, but at least the richer, more structured countries will be there to cope. That now is not the case, and we now know that there are two particular regions which are going to be more affected than any others. One is the Arctic, which is warming far faster than the rest of the world, and that will certainly lead to sea level rises, particularly if we start to see the erosion of the Greenland ice cap. But the other actually is the tropics and subtropics, particularly north of the equator. There's a huge belt, sorry for the sound technician for that. There's a huge belt all the way around the world, north of the equator, through to basically the latitude of, say, central Spain, which is going to be particularly affected, heating up more and drying out more. And that will also affect the southern latitudes to an extent as well. The effect on the Amazonian rainforest could be astonishing. If it is thought that the worldwide temperature was to go up by 3 degrees, it's gone up by 1 degree almost so far, the reckoning is that Amazonia will go up by about 9 degrees. That would mean that you would essentially see the Amazonian rainforest, which is one of the biggest carbon sinks of all, storing carbon, lost, because bit by bit it would burn, almost at the level of the wildfires we're getting in Indonesia as I speak. So it's this asymmetry that is so difficult. But the other factor is that it is, as far as one can tell, slowly but surely accelerating. In fact, what we've seen really this year is an indication of that, because as many of you will be aware, over the last 20 years or so, you have had an increase in temperature average, which seems to have slightly paused a little bit over the last 5 to 8 years. That's been welcomed as deniers by saying that climate change isn't happening. But it's long been recognized that there are natural ups and downs in world temperatures. It goes up a bit, then down a bit. And one of the main factors is the so-called Southern Oscillation. We know it more commonly as one of its key components was the El Niño-La Niña effect. And those were more or less out of sync until last year, and now they seem to be in sync, which is why this year is well nigh certain to be the hottest year worldwide on average ever recorded. And we're likely to see quite major increases in temperature between now and 2020. So we have these factors, but the key thing to all of this is that what it does as climate change takes root is that it undermines the ecological carrying capacity of huge areas of croplands to produce food at the level they do at present. And this is at a time when the population is still growing worldwide. And essentially, that will be the downside if we do not get climate change under control. And essentially, that would mean all kinds of issues, which I'll come on to very shortly. Then we come to the third factor. And this, if you like, is the way that security is seen. Essentially, you would call it the paradigm of the control paradigm. When push comes to shove, the more powerful, more well-off, more comfortable parts of the world will, if they see themselves threatened, use force to prevent that threat. And it's certainly fair to say that, any major military group around, say, in the Western world, particularly the major think tanks, are looking to what are going to be the future threats and how to handle them. Let me tell an anecdote on this one. About 3 years ago, I had an email, more or less out of the blue, from a colleague who works at the Changing Character of War program, which is based at Pembroke College, Oxford University. And he said they were running a seminar. It's part of a series they run about one a year for a particular small foundation. They were running a seminar on the security complexities and consequences of weak and failing states. How would future problems of weak and failing states affect British security? And they had a series of experts on different parts of the world which might be prone to this sort of problem, but they wanted somebody just to give a bit of an overview at the start before getting the really knowledgeable people in. And would I be prepared to do the overview, because I sort of do work a little bit on broad brush issues. It was a one-day conference, and it seemed quite interesting. It was down at Wadham College. The guy was not really quite forthcoming about who the participants would be, so I assumed they would probably be diplomats from the Foreign Office or such. So I went down and took part, and it turned out that the participants were the commandant and all the senior officers of the SAS, joined by people from MI6, the Defence Intelligence Staff, and the Foreign Office. And this is one of a series of seminars that are held more or less annually, funded not by the taxpayer, by a private foundation, which actually enables the elite military forces to look ahead at the kinds of issues they're going to face. And in many ways, I've met that. I'm lecturing in a couple of weeks at the Royal College of Defence Studies. I've met that when I've been talking to military think tanks. These are serious professional people who are looking ahead long term as to what they have to do. And in fact, if you read the reports coming from outfits such as the Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre down at Shrivenham, they will give the same kind of analysis that we're going through this afternoon. That marginalisation, refugee flows, migration, climate change, they add other things as well, the possible rise of China or the re-rise of Russia, but they tend to focus long term on these issues. But the thing is that from their perspective, quite naturally, what they're about is keeping their own country or their own alliance secure. So what they're looking at is how to maintain the situation as it is at a time when you may get all sorts of problems developing. What it is not doing is going beyond that to look at the underlying reasons why we're getting these problems. And that is the real difficulty that one has. I mean, if we're looking at what the risks would be, and this is just the worst case because there are really good alternatives to this, but if you're looking at what the risks would be, then essentially, if climate change continues to develop as it is developing now and moves into pretty whole-scale climate disruption, the richest countries will more or less be able to cope at least for 2 or 3 decades. If it gets completely out of control, then nobody will be really in a very good position to do very much. But the richer countries would be able to do it. But those countries experiencing the biggest changes, also the poorest countries by and large, will have huge difficulty. You would move into an era of very considerable anger and resistance and resentment, not just against their own states, but other states that are part and parcel of a system which is seen as deeply unfair. There will be huge pressures of movements of population. One major study done by a Migration Research Centre reckons that if climate change was to really develop along predicted paths within 20 years, the numbers of people wanting to move would not be the 20 to 30 million we have now, but more like 400 million. And people would be desperate to move. And such movement will be constrained. And those are the conditions in which you get much more violent movements. So that is the kind of issue that we're going to face. And for my mind, we're into an era, not so much of age of insurgencies against radical Islam, not so much a clash of civilizations against radical Islam, but a kind of age of insurgencies, revolts from the margins. And this is what is recognized in military circles as being the kinds of problems we're going to face in the future. Of course, I'm saying we're all the time. What I mean is us in the richer communities, either here or in other parts of the world. And if you go back to what Brooks was saying, the crowded, glowering planet of massive inequalities of wealth, buttressed by stark force, the phenomenon of the protected city or the protected compound, the secure compound, is far more common now than it was 50 years ago. Right across the global south, and to an extent in countries like Britain as well. I remember going through a very well-off, let me put it nicely, housing estate out in the home counties not so long ago. And as you drive along a road, which is actually a public road, there's a little indicator board which just throws up your number plate. In other words, as you enter this estate, public road, your number is recorded and they put it on the thing so you know that they know your car is going through. And that is the kind of phenomenon on a very small scale that we're seeing more and more worldwide. And in a sense, we have the security defense, the Strategic Defense and Security Review due to be published quite soon. I would hope that it would recognize that we have this sort of problem and that it cannot be controlled by military means. I very much doubt it. So let me finish by looking at the other side, because the title of this talk, very ambitiously, I'm afraid, far too ambitiously, was Future Wars and How to Prevent Them. I suppose, in short, it's easy. What you have to do is move to a much more equitable global economic system, and one which is progressively, within 20 years, ultra low carbon. Now, it's very easy to say that in a single sentence, but it is a massive requirement. So let's finish off by looking at some of the positive signs, because an awful lot is happening. The first one, which I think is particularly fitting for London, is to remember that if knowledge is available and people are thinking through the alternatives, when events happen which make it absolutely clear that a choice has to be made, you can get very quick action. I will betray my age by saying that as a boy, aged 9, I was in London in the winter, living in London, going to school in Walthamstow in the winter of 1952, and that was the winter of the Great Smog of London. That lasted for 4 days. It was a combination of basically a thermal inversion layer over a city rich in coal fires and industry, where the smoke could not get out, formed smog, and it was terrible. I mean, certainly if we're in this lecture theatre now, if that had been in the open, I would have only been able to see the first 4 rows. That's all. And that lasted for the best part of 4 days. Some of you, I'm sure, will remember it. In that period, at least 10,000 people died. At the time, it was supposed to be 4,000. The epidemiologist later said it was far more. People who were mostly elderly, bronchitic, asthmatic, and the rest died, and they died in their thousands. It affected, though, the media, the print media and the radio mostly at that time, and the politicians who were in session. What it did was speed up hugely the introduction of Clean Air Acts right across Britain. Probably brought them forward about 5 years or so, because people were already arguing that something had to be done. This has proved that it had to be done. Those of us from London who know our history will know, in fact, that you can go back through deeper history to the famous Great Stink of London in 1858. And that was when the complete lack of any kind of major sewage system meant that the whole of the Thames and the subsidiary rivers had become one gigantic sewer. So much so that it was far too smelly to even go near the Thames. And even Parliament, in its wisdom, decided to sit somewhere else. But it was so bad that the people who had already been saying this growing city has to have a proper sewage system, Sir Joseph Bazalgette and the Metropolitan Water Board and the rest got their way. And Bazalgette and his team built the northern and southern outfall sewers. To be absolutely frank, what they did is took all the crud downriver and put it down in the low reaches of the tidal Thames. But to be fair to them, in the succeeding years, you had some of the world's biggest sewage farms like Bacton built, and more or less intermediately sorted out the system, and incidentally did very much to see the final days of cholera in London. But that was one event which actually, in a sense, catalysed what was known to be necessary action. And in some ways, much more recently, Joe Harmon and his team finding about the ozone depletion problem spurred very quick action. There's a very interesting little story about that, because when Harmon and the group reported to the British Antarctic Survey what they'd actually found out, this was then checked with NASA in the United States, which did actually have satellites up which could have picked up this anomaly, but apparently hadn't been doing so. And so there's this anomaly. We knew it was happening because of actual ground measurements, but the satellites, admittedly 1980s, perhaps not quite as advanced as they are now, were not actually picking it up. And it turned out that there was a programming element in the satellites that if a satellite suddenly recorded an absence of ozone, that was categorized as an instrument failure and was regarded as something which couldn't be happening. And when they reassessed their data, it confirmed what the BAS team was saying, which is one of the reasons very quickly why you had the Montreal Convention formed. So it's yet another example of what can happen. So I suppose what I'm suggesting is, on the positive side, there's a very good way of defining the term prophecy. You define prophecy as suggesting the future. And that is very much the kind of stage we're in now, both on the economic side and the ecological side as well. And there is some extraordinarily good work going on already and actions being taken in both areas. I mean, one thing just to remember is that the world does not work entirely on a free market system. There are currently 950 million people who are members of cooperatives, mostly, but by no means all, in the global south. There are already alternative ways of one sort or another. There's some extraordinary work being done at the moment by the New Economics Foundation. Its Great Transition Project. It's developing quite a complex but workable econometric model of the British economy, which feeds in the need to go ultra-low carbon and more equitable. I learned from one of them recently that in fact most econometric models don't actually factor in the way banks and finance houses behave in response to economic changes. They don't actually factor in behavior of financial institutions and many other things they don't factor in, which is one of the reasons why these models tend to take one particular route. But NEF, New Economics Foundation, is looking at it differently. You've got people like, what's his name, the guy who wrote Prosperity Without Growth, Tim Jackson, thanks so much. Tim Jackson, Prosperity Without Growth. There's a lot going on in this field which is suggesting different ways forward. And of course within Britain we have this very interesting political development of the last few months where you now have two major parties, one in Scotland and one in the UK as a whole, who are basically saying austerity is a political choice. It makes, if nothing else, whatever you think of their views, it opens up the debate in a way we've not seen really for, I would say, 20, 30 years. And so on the economic side, that's just a tiny bit of what's happening in Britain. You look across the world, lots and lots of new thinking going on, if you like, suggesting the possible. You look at the low carbon side, and here the developments are quite astonishing in terms of even the technological sides. I mean, we're now moving into an era where just for the start, people are now starting to talk about divestment from fossil carbon. That in fact, this is economically a dangerous thing to have so much of your future potential actually locked up in something which is not actually burnable. Because in fact, if you began to burn even half of the remaining available fossil carbon, coal, gas and oil, then the planetary system would be more or less entirely wrecked. There are all kinds of new technologies which are coming forward, or older technologies which are being improved. And one of the startling things is how quickly things can be taken up. One of the most remarkable examples of the last 5 years or so is the very rapid take-up of very simple, quite small scale solar cells linked to batteries and light-emitting diode LED lights. So in other words, a very simple device which in cost is about the same cost as a few months of kerosene for an old dirty lamp, will actually produce 5 or 6 hours of good light every evening if it's left out in the open during the day. And those are selling by wildfire right across much of the global south, primarily so far in sub-Saharan Africa. There are many, many, many other examples of what can be done given the political will. And a number of countries are actually doing this. One of our sons is actually a renewable energy engineer who works in the tropics. He works mainly in the West Indies. And it's interesting how some of the West Indies islands, who basically are entirely dependent on oil for all their electricity and just about everything else, are suddenly seriously waking up to the incredible solar and wind potential that they have. And this is repeated time after time. We're not yet at the point worldwide where either the new kind of economic thinking or the new developments on green technologies have become fully mainstream. We're not there yet. And it may be, and one says this reluctantly, that you will have to have the boost when we do get very major weather events. Because one of the issues with climate change, which is very clear, is that one of the quite early effects is not that you get more severe weather events, more frequent weather events, but the individual ones do become more severe. That typhoon which hit the Philippines a couple of years ago, Haiyan I think it was called, when it hit landfall on one of the southern Philippine islands, the speed was astonishing. You know, when we hear about a hurricane, I mean, the one we call a hurricane which hit southeast England, 20 or 30 years ago, peaked at about 90 miles an hour. That is not a level of a tropical storm. It did huge amounts of damage, but basically because people were caught almost completely by surprise. But if you look at how hurricanes, cyclones, or typhoons, they're all the same thing, are actually measured, they're measured by the average speed for a 10-minute period, okay? And that particular typhoon had an average speed for 10 minutes of 160 miles an hour. About twice as fast as we get in any major storm in Britain ever, except on top of the Cairngorms. And that actually is an indicator of the sorts of issues we're going to have in the future. Now, in a sense, you're almost getting very pessimistic. You're saying, well, you know, we're going to have huge disasters with huge numbers of people killed before people take notice. And this, in a sense, I think, is the kind of race that we're facing. Are we ready earlier to start making the really big changes? Or do we have to wait until there are such disasters that we're forced into action? Whether it's the former or the latter depends hugely on the amount of work to show the positive things that can be done in the short term, to demonstrate what can be done and what can be done pretty easily. The fact that some forms of renewable power are now right down to grid parity with electricity produced by burning coal, getting very close to it in many parts of the world. So even economically, it is starting to make much more sense, quite apart from the utter environmental lead. But let me finish off by coming back to the overall theme, and we're talking about security and future wars. In a nutshell, I think what one has to recognize is the tendency to control new threats by means of, if need be, maintaining the status quo. The term I use for this is lidism. You keep the lid on things rather than going underneath for the actual underlying causes. And the thing is, it is not actually workable in the kind of world that we're facing. We have huge opportunities, but the risk is we see things in the old way. We're now into the 15th year of the war on terror, and the news this week is of an expansion of Taliban and indeed ISIS activity in Afghanistan, that ISIS has made further gains in Syria, that it has now decided to develop the capability to bring down airliners abroad, that it is taking root in other parts of the world. And this is nearly 15 years after we thought the way to handle it was by military means. And you talk seriously to recently retired military who are very open about the extent of the failure and the fact that it is not recognized and not understood and not appreciated more generally. People on the inside know how bad it's been, but essentially there's almost a kind of omerta, a war of silence, about how badly it's gone wrong. And that, though, is an indication that lidism, controlling things, not going underneath, is simply not working. And we've really got to rethink things out. I think if there's one lesson to come out of the experience in the terrible events of 9/11, it is the way that we chose to respond has not worked, and that's a very strong indicator that if we're really going to face the problems of a divided and constrained world, if we think we can maintain the status quo for maybe a fifth of the world's population, it will not work. So I will conclude by saying we're in an extraordinarily important era. I think the timescale really is between now and 2045, or more crucially, between 2015 and maybe 2030. That is when you have to have very big changes taking place in how we think about security. If we do, then I think we could look forward in longer term future to a world which becomes more peaceful. If we don't, then I think we face a very difficult period. My wife and I have 3 grandchildren. One is age 7, one is age 4, and one is age 1. All 3 of those could be alive in the 22nd century. They'd be in their late 80s, early 90s. It would be lovely to think that not when they're that old, but even when they're in their 60s, in the 2060s and 2070s, they can look back then from a world which is actually decidedly more peaceful and more stable and fairer. And it would be even nicer if they could look back and say, well, that was due to the kind of thinking and actions that were taken by those people in the 2010s and 2020s. I think it's a heck of an aim to aim for, but we do have a very considerable responsibility to further generations to actually do it. Thanks very much. Could I suggest, as I said at the start, that we just take 1 minute, just perhaps talk among ourselves, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussion. And so people who do have to leave, please feel free to leave at this point. I have one down here first, please.
Thank you for an extraordinarily compelling and all too credible analysis, sir, and we really appreciate it, I'm sure. There was a very good book recently written by Owen Jones called Establishment, and he at one point lists a lot of think tanks, government think tanks, which are very influential, which he said were largely concerned with establishing the status quo. And he singled out the NEF, the New Economics Foundation, as being one which was virtually being ignored by both the media and by government. My question is, how can your voice be heard, or voices like yours be heard, within the United Nations to influence governments? Because you did say a very important point, you added a caveat, if we had the political will, these things could be done. How can we get the political will?
I think it's probably the responsibility of all of us who want to try and do it in many different ways. Incidentally, I mean, Owen Jones's book, The Establishment, my wife and I have both read it from cover to cover, and we very rarely do non-fiction books of that length. It's an absolutely fascinating book. For me, one of the most interesting things about it was the description of how an establishment system works in a country like Britain. And it's not a question of almost of apportioning blame on the people at the centre. It's the entire nature of the system and the way it works, which really means that power and influence resides in very few areas. In some areas it's very blatant. I mean, essentially, the majority of all the national print media in Britain is owned by three families: the Murdochs, the Barclays, and the Rodmers, all who have one particular political stance. And that's a problem one faces, because obviously you want to try and get as wide a range of view as possible. You're absolutely right, the NEF is relatively unrecognised by most politicians. It's interesting that I think, again, we don't know what this change in the Labour Party is going to mean, but it is opening up the debates. And you're getting, some of the people who've worked with NEF actually appearing on Newsnight, almost for the first time. Because, the national broadcast media is now giving a wider range of voices, are just starting to. So that is why I think both the SNP and the Labour changes are so interesting. I mean, in a dispassionate way. I won't say whether I'm for or against it, you might be able to guess. But essentially, it really is significant there. But I think one has to try and use every opportunity you can, wherever possible, from as good a base of knowledge as you can. It is, if you're speaking with reasonable knowledge, and in fact, the NEF website, I think it's neweconomics.org, is very good on this, and some of the stuff they produce is very good. If you wanted something more on the security side, I would recommend Oxford Research Group and their work they're doing on sustainable security. And there are lots of others as well on the nuclear side, basic always, and there are another safer world as well. You're absolutely right, or I'd agree, put it this way, I'd agree very much with Owen Jones, that you do have a network of major influential think tanks which tend to take things from one particular view. Not all, there are some which really remain rigorously independent, and one would list the Institute for Fiscal Studies on that, because they've been doing very hard-headed analysis of different economic changes. But it is an issue because you find, in fact, that the think tanks that are trying to do the different thinking have the devil's own job in raising money to do it. On the security side, you're left with just a few trusts, mostly Quaker, and particularly Joseph Rowntree, that are actually supporting a lot of this work. It's very difficult to get funding. The Network for Social Change does some good work as well. But essentially, one can support that kind of work. The information is there on the websites and the rest, and essentially, it's really a question of arguing. People like me will do our best, but if everybody can be involved in different ways, then at least it raises the level of awareness and debate and makes more people think, and that's much we can ask for. It's an important ask, actually. Please, one over here, please.
Vijay Mehta, Chair, United for Peace. Thank you very much for all the problems we are going to get in the next 20, 30 years. But realistically, we got 40 conflicts and 11 civil wars at this moment in time raging in the world. So, what do you think, especially areas like Middle East and North Africa, and also on our doorstep on the Eastern Europe, like the Ukraine? What do you think we should be doing about them? And secondly, I have never seen so much in the last 30, 40 years, vilification and demonization of Russia and Putin itself. So that's not helping at all. So what do you think we can do about the new Cold War which is coming and all these conflicts which are raging before we go on to the
longer term.
conflicts and longer term. Thank you, Paul.
We probably need a sort of an hour to do that justice, I'm afraid, and I was looking long term, but I'll just say a few words. Well, let's take the particular thing at the moment. I think the Chief of Defence Staff and Michael Fallon have both said, one this morning, one yesterday, that what has happened in Sinai means we've got to bomb Syria. We've got to extend the war. And essentially the answer has been so far to use air power. Tease that out a bit. Over the last 15 months, the United States believes that it and its coalition partners have killed between 15 and 20,000 ISIS supporters in the air war. It's far more intense than is being reported in the routine media. Because it's being done from the air, there are no boots on the ground of our people getting killed, bluntly. Over that same period, the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA and others have reassessed the number of young people who've gone to join ISIS. And they've reassessed it from 15 to 30,000 over that same period. So in other words, ISIS is getting more and more recruits the more it is bombed. And it is succeeding in taking new territory in Syria as it is slightly more constrained in Iraq. And as I was saying, the ideas are spreading in different ways in different parts of the world, including Boko Haram in Nigeria, the problems down the Swahili coast, Somalia, Yemen, and of course in the North Caucasus, where the Caucasus Emirate is causing huge problems. As an immediate response, and this is strictly personal, I would not in any way want Britain to extend the air war. I would agree with what in fact Justin Trudeau has done and pulled the Canadian Air Force out of Syria and Iraq, because it is actually counterproductive. The reason it's counterproductive is ISIS wants to be attacked. It wants war. It perniciously presents itself as the guardian of Islam under attack from the Crusader West. The overwhelming majority of Muslims hate that. They don't like using even the term Islamic State because it is abhorrent to Islam as a whole. But to a small minority, it strikes a chord. And you have the long-standing Israel-Palestinian problem, which is a running sore as well. Now at this point, people turn around and say, okay, well, what would you advocate? Well, there are two things, certainly. One is, there is a massive humanitarian problem in the surrounding countries. Lebanon, Turkey, and in particular, Jordan. You know, nearly 4 million people, many of them in wretched camps facing winter in those surrounding countries. A huge amount of aid is needed. The UNHCR cannot cope, it is not coping. And we face an absolute disaster this winter unless aid goes in very quickly. The British aren't too bad by international standards. They're rather better in other countries. Why on earth the British government doesn't call an urgent conference to get this whole programme at a much higher level? It's beyond belief, because this is in humanitarian interest. But also, you know, if you get people in these camps absolutely unable to get away, more and more resentful, it's a recruiting ground for ISIS. So if you want to do it on enlightened self-interest, it makes sense. That's the most important thing at present. The other thing we have to recognise is that very rare thing in international security, a double proxy war. You've got the rebels backed by the Saudis, the Americans, the British, the French, and the Emiratis and the Kuwaitis and the rest. And so you have the Saudis and the Kuwaitis locally, and then you have the bigger Western countries beyond that, two levels of proxy. On the other side, you have the Assad regime, which is backed by Iran, and behind that Russia. If you bring those all together, bearing in mind the differences between the Saudis and the Iranians, you may make progress. That just started last Saturday week with the first round of events in Vienna. And it is fair to say that if you look for good news right across the region, the fact that relations between Washington and Tehran are the best they've been for a decade is actually good news, because that means there's some possibility of coming together. And one suspects that behind the scenes, there's actually quite a lot of communicating between the Americans and the Russians at the present time. But if you're going to get a long-term end to the ISIS problem and constraining ISIS, you won't defeat it militarily, but constraining it, then you've actually got to bring an end in some way to the Syrian civil war and persuade a reforming Iraqi government to reach out to the Sunni minority. As far as Ukraine and Russia is concerned, you really do worry here because, I mean, there are two levels of it. Putin is extremely clever at playing the Russian national card. Remember, there is deep resentment in Russia at the way Russia was treated as a state in the 1990s. We have a Russian daughter-in-law who is no fan of Putin, but she is able to tell us, how the Russian perception exists. Russia was treated as a basket case in the 1990s. And that basically is something that Putin uses all the time. And of course, the older ones among us still have the vision of the gigantic Soviet state, the all-encompassing military giant. That is not Russia at the present time. The danger, of course, it is still nuclear armed, but people tend to forget the entire gross national product of the whole of Russia with 140 million people is no bigger than that of Britain or France. 2/3 of that of Germany, fairly small fraction of that of Japan, and a pretty tiny fraction of that of China and the United States. That is a country in severe economic difficulty. Putin plays a bad hand very well, but there's no way that he can sustain what they're doing in Syria for any length of time unless they damage their own economy more. But the problem is that we now see them almost as the new enemy. And I have to say it's very easy to look for enemies. In fact, and this is, I may be getting a bit cynical here, one tends to think just a little bit that maybe some of the world's arms companies are breathing a sigh of relief. They've now got two enemies instead of one. They've got ISIS and the Russians, and that is very good for business. And I think we've got to rise above this. Putin is not easy to handle by any means because of his nature and the way he plays the system. But we've also got to get a sense of perspective on this and recognize that there are perceptions on both sides. You have to see the world from the other side as well as your own side if you're going to get anywhere. We're just not good at doing this. Please, yes, the one.
Frank Jackson, former co-chair of the World Disarmament Campaign. Just following up Vijay's question and yours. First of all, there is the whole question of the Middle East being awash with arms of all kinds, and the continued flow of arms, including particularly ammunition. I always wonder why people aren't shocked when they show pictures of these militants, or whoever they are, with a bandolier of the bullets, and even the AK-47s are no good without bullets. So I don't know how they keep on getting the weapons, the ammunition in particular, and what can be done about it. However, what you said about bombing being counterproductive, I think the vast majority of the ordinary public would agree with you there. So my question is, why is it that the people in the position to make decisions, the government, Michael Fallon and all the rest, don't see what is so glaringly obvious for ordinary people?
Well, one issue I think one needs to tease out here is, in broad terms, the military, the ordinary soldiers in Britain are quite popular. The wars they fight are not. It's a very significant difference. There is popularity for the young people going to fight. There may be an unease, but there's a much greater unease about the wars themselves. I think in this particular area, it may be the politicians are actually behind public opinion. But on the other hand, there's a very powerful kind of establishment which does see it just one particular way. I mean, it's brought home very clearly at the time of the Tahrir Square demonstrations, when David Cameron, in fact, stopped, in a sense, to support the demonstrators. He was actually on the way to take a large team of arms salesmen to the Middle East to sell weapons. And this is the problem. And it's easy to pick anybody. I mean, this is true of all governments of recent years. I mean, the last person to sort of hold Britain back from a major war was probably Harold Wilson at the time of Vietnam, when he was under heavy pressure for Britain to go in with the United States. But that's what 50 years ago. And I think the point is we have a kind of an establishment system in Britain which is, it's locked into one view, and it's very difficult to break. I mean, I hope this won't offend people. I have a little bit of a problem with the fact that the British Legion is heavily sponsored by 2 of the 3 world's largest arms industries, Lockheed and BAE Systems. I'm sorry that they've taken that route, because I think in a sense, very few people know that, but it is true. And I think that's sad in a way. But it's part of a wider problem. I think it particularly affects Britain and France because of our imperial pasts. You know, we see ourselves as very significant countries, but we see it in one particular way, and that's in terms of hard security. I think Britain could have a hugely significant role worldwide with its Commonwealth, transatlantic and European connections in a much more positive way. You know, much bigger on areas like peacekeeping in the UN and the rest. There's huge scope for there, but we're missing it. We haven't yet found that role. But I suppose it's something to do with the way the entire system works and has evolved, and I think it is actually starting to get out of sync with how more and more people think. One over here. Pat.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about suggesting the future and suggesting the positive and the possible. And I'm just interested, I assume that a lot of the students you have at Bradford are still international. That's always been one of its features. And I just maybe wonder if you could tell us of some of the signs of hope among the student population, this international body of people who are working for the future. And maybe just give us a glimpse of some of the areas, some of the concerns, the research work that's being done that's moving us in this direction.
We've got cover a whole range. I mean, one of the things I've not dealt with at all today, really, I should have done, was the whole issue of arms control and disarmament. But we have a particular, very strong group at Bradford which looks at biological and chemical weapons and the borderline between riot control and chemical arms and how they can be prevented and how they can be controlled. And we have a number of students doing their PhDs on that as well. I suppose our most interesting group every year are our master's students. We get between 60 and 80. In fact, the numbers are actually going up at present, in spite of all the border controls. And they are extraordinary people from all over the world. They're very tough to teach because, you know, anything you say, somebody will know more about it. It's great for a lecture, it really is, but God, it can be exhausting. But essentially, many of them come in their 30s and 40s. They've got lots of experience. They've worked, some of them come directly from conflict zones. They go on to do extraordinary work. I mean, one of our earlier ones, in fact, my second ever PhD student at Bradford was Saeb Erekat, who's now the chief Palestinian negotiator with the Israelis, and has been for the last 10 years. And our students are going into that sort of work. Sadly, in a way, you know, any major conflict, conflict resolution and peace building experts tend to say you get 1 year of war, it takes 4 to 5 years to rebuild the peace. So you get a war in the Balkans over sort of 5 or 6 years, it could take 20 or 30 years. But wherever you find that situation where the guns have stopped firing and peace is beginning to be restored, you will find students, past students from Bradford, from Coventry, from Notre Dame and other universities, and more universities in the tropics that are actually got people working there. We find there's much more interest in peace research and conflict resolution in the global south than was 30, 40 years ago. And our head of department, David Francis, who himself is from Sierra Leone, we have links with a whole range of African universities. There's a lot happening, and at the practical level, I don't know, I'd have to pick them out and go on, but believe me, there's a huge amount that is developing, and we're learning all the time. I mean, peace studies obviously works primarily in areas of conflict resolution, peace building, and also issues of disarmament and arms control. And what I've been talking about today brings us much more into the environmental field, where others are doing that kind of work. And Britain has some extremely, I mean, we have one of the world's best centres for oceanography at Southampton, one of the world's best centres for climate change, the Hadley Centre at Exeter, and a number of very good universities which are doing really pioneering work on basically indicating the future. You know, the work on sustainables that goes on at Loughborough is extraordinary. A whole department focused on sustainable futures. Bradford, although it does not do much work in this area, has an extraordinary director of estates. And over the last 15 years, he has systematically started to clad all the 1960s heat sink buildings in mod materials and make them highly efficient buildings. And any building that they build is new is extraordinarily efficient. They just completed one block and they had to decide whether to put any heating in at all, because they expected they could control it by a combination of solar gain and the heat of the human body. They decided reluctantly that in a bad winter there might be 2 weeks when they need some heat, so they have a evacuating system in. But there's a lot going on in that way, on the peace side, on the environment side, on that kind of issue as well. And you know, in a sense, it's the unrecognised size of what is happening. Then it's one of the things, I'm very lucky to work at a place like that, because you can see the signs of hope all over the place. But the other thing, to repeat what I said earlier, is the speed at which people will take up new ideas when they see they work. I mean, one of the earliest lessons I learned when I went to work in Uganda was the fact that there were some of the staple crops, like maize and tomatoes and the rest, were New World crops. And they'd been introduced to Eastern Africa maybe 100 years ago, and were very rapidly taken up by small farmers when they realized they worked better. There wasn't this kind of conservatism. As long as they knew they would produce some better conditions for themselves and their families, they would take it up quickly. And the speed of take-up can be very much quicker than we realize. It's also, one has to remember that under conditions of sudden change, how quickly things can be done. It's a curious example, but look at the process of demobilization in Britain and the United States in 1945 and 46. In Britain, you had to reintegrate the best part of 3 or 4 million people into economies which were already crippled. At that stage, the government chose to actually invest heavily by borrowing. It set up a bigger debt problem, but it worked, and it gave us the welfare state as well. And that was very sudden in a way. In the United States, it was nearly 10 million people had to be reintegrated very quickly, but it could be done. So I suppose in a way, you always look to what can be done and how quickly it can be done. But the real thing is, more and more examples of how you do it is what counts. And I think, you know, Bradford, Coventry and elsewhere, that's one of the things our students really do. And one's very proud of them, I must say. Please.
Thank you very much for this work. No. One of the books you've talked about is The Establishment. Another one which relates very closely to what you've been saying about the need for fast action on climate change is Naomi Klein's.
Yes.
This changes everything. And I missed the first 10 minutes, I'm sorry of it all, but I don't know if you've I didn't hear you mention the need for intervention in the market and the outdatedness of the market, because we're not going to be able to change fast enough without central control and intervention and dramatic, I mean, it goes against the kind of local democracy and all that, but in order to change the way in which we invest to get to a low carbon economy quickly enough, this is what leaves me with a kind of big uncertainty that our governments are just not thinking like that. They are going more and more for privatisation, more and more for marketisation, which is the wrong direction to be going in a situation where we need, you talk about the light bulb moment or the, you know, when a good idea suddenly strikes, but it's not enough for the idea to strike. There has to be a coordinated, centrally directed economic change. And I feel that has to be, it's something we have to grapple with, as well as building on good ideas.
No, I do agree with you absolutely. I mean, what one needs is sort of a combination of political wisdom and leadership. We're not getting it, bluntly, at least we're not at present. And one has to say, whatever your own party political view, the current government, what is done on the green side in the last 3 months is scandalous. Yeah. Virtually everything has been ground to a halt. You know, the key one, which people don't even notice, is we have this scheme from next year, all new housing was going to be of a much higher standard environmentally. That's just been cancelled, completely, just overnight just been cancelled. No, we're in a very difficult time on that in Britain, and I have to accept that. But you know, you can get changes. Finally, Obama has actually stopped the Keystone project. You've had a change almost overnight in Ottawa with Justin Trudeau coming in. It's a very difficult problem because Canada makes so much out of those oil sands. But there's going to be a curbing of them. And the Canadians are finally going to accept, as many do privately already, that climate change is happening. And it's serious. No, I've got no direct answer except I have to agree with you that this has to happen at government and intergovernmental level, which is why there is so much resistance, because it is directly against what I have to call the neoliberal ideology, which just does not, the genuine belief, and I would say it is a belief, it's an ideology, is that the free market is the answer, that it does work. And I remember back in around 1990, people said, the centrally planned system didn't work, it's now consigned to the dustbin of history, and we have the one system which works. And I heard people saying at the time, well, in fact, that system isn't going to work either. Doesn't mean the centrally planned one was the right one, it's probably the wrong one. But this too will eventually have to be consigned to the dustbin, and we have to just develop something more. The kind of work that NEF is doing illustrates what we're going to have to develop. The kind of writings of people like Naomi Klein shows it. It's going to be a tough call, and I think the next 5 to 10 years are going to be absolutely crucial if we're going to make it. How things can happen, I don't know. But the thing is, things can happen very much more quickly than people realise when the light bulb moment comes. It'll come quicker if we know what to do when it comes. I think Bruce was next. I think you were next, actually, earlier. Bruce, go on.
Kent of Moore and C&D. I'd just like to ask whether you agree that there's something rather odd, as I see it, that many of the major development and environmental agencies, who are only too happy to talk about climate change, and even to acknowledge the war will be a consequence of climate change, don't acknowledge that militarization of the planet now, costing nearly $2 trillion a year, is actually a cause of climate change. Now, why do they leave this factor out? That's the question that I like to ask, because it's the missing link, really, in the present campaigning system. They talk about climate change, but they don't tie up with the peace groups.
I have to say, Bruce, I don't know what the answer is, but I agree with you. I mean, an example from history, 40 years ago we had the world food crisis. We came the nearest to intercontinental famine that we'd ever had. And essentially, it was avoided by sudden international action, but the FAO at the time worked out how to prevent it happening again and what you would need to spend on sustainable research into sustainable agriculture. And essentially, they actually reckoned the prices at the time, it was $5 billion a year for 10 years in dollars. That was 2% of world spending on the military. That was all that was required. And it was never spent, which is why even now, some was spent, but nothing like enough. Even now, we have a huge problem of malnutrition, actually now affecting twice as many people as in 1974. I don't know the answer to that, Bruce, but it's a very important missing link, which I think we have to push whenever we can. One at the back, I think, was there. No, this gentleman here, please.
Sorry, my name is Nigel Spate. In view of the urgency that you have rightly emphasised and the new Labour leadership, can I presume that there are some links between you and Jeremy Corbyn, and that you'll be invited onto some think tank and help Jeremy Corbyn to push these issues and educate the British people to win the next election?
Well, my attitude, I mean, I'm an academic, I'm paid my salary, I work part-time, still paid by the taxpayer, and I would gladly offer advice to any group that was interested in it. And it's fair to say that I have been involved in, things in the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office during the present and recent governments. Civil servants will talk. I've lectured at defence colleges for 30 years. They will listen. They may disagree, but they will listen. And I have at different times provided briefings for Conservative, Lib Dem, Green and Labour members of Parliament. And certainly, and people like me, there are other people working in this field. I certainly know for sure that Corbyn is engaging on the economic side, and some of his people are already talking to the people at New Economics Foundation. And I suspect, I'll put it no stronger than that he will be reaching out to talk to people on the security side as well.
I've got two questions which go back to the whole question of resources and positive models. And first of all, it's fantastic seeing what's happening in parts of Africa with solar energy, batteries, LEDs. It's equally fantastic seeing what's happening in Scandinavia. Denmark is at almost 50% energy from renewable sources. It's never had nuclear. It has virtually no fossil fuels. And its tipping point came about 5 years ago when two islands were competing to be first to be 100% reliant on renewable energy, and they turned into 110% and were able, in fact, to export energy. So I think we need to be emphasizing models like that.
Yes, absolutely.
But the other one is a political one. And We hear a lot about the conflicts arising because of resource depletion, particularly water shortage. But there are very positive examples of collaboration and cooperation around bodies of water, around the Rhine, around the Mediterranean. There are multi-country conventions and agreements which have kept peace, sort of managed resources, certainly done a better job than the market would have. And I think models like that need to be emphasized. So where do we find more examples, and how do we set about emphasizing the positive cases?
I'm not sure. I mean, I agree absolutely with you in both areas. I mean, although it's not international, one of the most remarkable examples of sort of water use was the Tennessee Valley Authority, among a whole series of US states at a worse time economically, you know, back in the 1930s. On the environment side, well, I say one of my sons works in the Caribbean. You know, one particular island has the possibility, if it could get the money, of actually combining electric cars with photoelectric cells. So in other words, what you have, you know, anywhere in the tropics, you park your car under a tin roof during the day because it's so hot. Instead of a tin roof, you have a PV array. It's an electric car. You plug your car in during the day. And so, you know, but you then have to have cheap, basic electric cars. If an island's only 30 miles across, then it charges fully for all you need. But there are all kinds of things. Examples. I think the Danish example is particularly good. It really is on that. And interestingly, there's a new issue of National Geographic magazine just out now in time for Paris, which has a lot of this stuff in it. But there are loads of examples of this, and in a sense, it's an antidote to the pessimism we naturally feel when we look at the total size of the problem. There, please, yes.
Question is...
So, just at the microphone.
Yes. Would you try and write out and publish? I'm sure you already publish lots of things like your lecture today. I feel so much more hopeful. And I just think, I think people are a hell of a lot better than our government and so on. And I think so many people would respond to what you say today, and they just sit at home feeling hopeful. They may not have access to it. Hopeless, sorry. If it was really nice and fairly short and sort of reasonably just straightforward, not lots and lots of examples, but just hopeful. How do you do that?
Well, if you want to follow it through, I did a sort of pamphlet for Oxford Research Group about 2 years ago. It was 3 years ago. It was called, what was it? Chances for Peace in the Second Decade, What's Going Wrong and What We Must Do. Chances for Peace in the Second Decade. Oxford Research Group, check the publications, and you can take it, it's a 12-page PDF. If you want something different, if you just Google Jeff Tansey, that's Geoff, and then Tansey, Tansey. Jeff is a food security expert, and he's got a series of videos produced covering a whole range of areas. If you just Google him, it'll throw up Jeff Tansey's Food Academy, and you'll find a series of videos, one of which I did, which is a 30-minute video, very close to what I talked about this afternoon, just done a year or two back. But you'd be a glutton for punishment if you got to listen to it again, I'm afraid.
Could you please repeat that?
Okay, the first one is Chances for Peace in the Second Decade, Oxford Research Group. I think it was be about 3 years ago now. And it's available on their publication site. And then the other one is just, the easiest way is just Google Jeff Tansey in inverted commas. And you'll see on his main website, it's got reference to a series of videos, which are very good ones on specialist food security, but I did a general one for him, which covers the sort of things we're talking about today. But I think this is actually being videoed as well, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So this one will be available if you're a real glutton. We have time for one more? Yeah. Okay. Any more questions?
Very short. Do you see nuclear powers having any role to play in your vision of how things might go?
Do I see nuclear powers having any role? Again, it would take a long way to go through it, but broadly speaking, no. There are a number of reasons. One clear reason, Britain was the first country to go seriously into civil nuclear power. So we're the first country faced with decommissioning the old reactors. I don't know what the current estimate is, but none of this is being borne by the electricity industry. It is all being borne by the new Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. And the last estimate I saw was about £90 billion for dismantling and making permanently safe the first reactors. That's the Magnox series and the ones and the research reactors which preceded them. Why isn't this a big issue worldwide? Because within 10 to 20 years, all the other countries will face it. We went in first, we're the first ones to face it. There have been massive incentives given for Hinkley Point C. Incredible incentives, otherwise nobody will be prepared to build it. And the two power plants it is being modelled on in France and Finland are both years late and going over budget. Nuclear power in another era, done slowly and carefully and safely, might have been appropriate. In current circumstances, it won't help quick enough. That's my view. And one final question there, please.
I'm David Collins, and I work in renewable energy.
Right.
My question is just a comment for you to comment on. Professor Chris Rapley, who's a climate scientist at UCL, said at a recent talk that to combat global warming requires the greatest collective action in world history. Through what organisation or by what means could that be achieved?
Well, first I would agree with him. If you look at it in broad terms of human history, us as a species is going through the third transition now. The first was when we learned to farm 15,000 years ago, when the population went up by, what was it, eightfold in the space of a couple of thousand years. It was the origin of cities. The second transition was the Industrial Revolution. The third transition, which we are now into, is the transition to a sustainable world. And if we don't make it, it'll be absolutely disastrous. You asked, how do we do it? Wow. Well, I've tried to give there's a whole range of different ways. Ultimately, it's got to come from pressure from as many people as possible, as persistent and determined not to give up against all the odds. So when you get the reversals we've had in the last 3 or 4 months in Britain, that's actually got us to make even more determined to make and to win the arguments. It has to be done finally at government and intergovernmental level. And the United Nations is not yet fit for purpose, but it is worth remembering that it was the UNEP scientists back before 1983 who were pointing to the dangers of potential ozone depletion. It was the UNCTAD people, UN Conference on Trade and Development in the early 1960s, right back to UNCTAD 1 in 1964, who was saying you've actually got to have a very different kind of world economy. The reality is that elements within the UN system are often 10 or 20 years ahead of the times. I'd like to see that as a much more effective intergovernmental organisation, which means the lead countries have to commit some of their best people and be prepared to work cooperatively at a much greater level. I've not got any direct, complete answers for you, I'm afraid, except we just have to keep going and be persistent. And you know, I sometimes think that the greatest virtue of all is actually the virtue of hope. That you must actually have hope. I've worked in my career on nuclear issues and terrorism and other things. You get to the point in life where you have 3 choices. You either get suicidal, drunk, or you're an optimist. And Bruce will confirm, in the pub at lunchtime I only had a lemonade. I can't promise what I'll have afterwards, but anyway, thanks very much, and it's been great to be here, and I really do appreciate people's willingness to come and to discuss what is a key issue of our age. Thank you very much.